If you have ever been interested in the topic of early Roman history, then you have probably heard of the Etruscans who give Tuscany its modern name. These ancient people were already a splendid civilization in their own right when Rome was still a kingdom in the backwater of the Italian peninsula. It was the Etruscans who gave Rome much of the technology that they would later become so famous for, such as gladiatorial combat and their distinctive architecture. In this series on the Etruscans, I would like to take this time to explore their culture and their history, which I believe does not get the full attention that it deserves. Starting the series, we will look at the inhabitants of prehistoric Etruria, a people that we now call the Villanovans. Before even the Villanovans, the Apenninic culture lived across the Italian peninsula, named after the spinal mountain range of Italy, the Apennines. These people lived semi-nomadic lives, tending to flocks of sheep since the Bronze Age. They also held the practice of inhumation as a way to bury the dead. In the 10th century BC came a culture over the Alps called the Proto-Villanovans. These Proto-Villanovans were an urnfield culture, which means that their dead were cremated, placed in urns, and then buried. This earliest stage of Villanovan culture can hardly be distinguished from the other urnfield cultures in Central Europe, and it would take some time to develop. These newcomers to the Italian peninsula found a home in what would later become Etruria. Rather than forcefully removing the Apenninic people, however, the Proto-Villanovans lived side by side, as evidenced by inhumations and cremations being found together dating back to the 9th and 10th centuries. The Villanovans revolutionized the society in Italy as they brought with them advanced farming techniques and fully permanent settlements. The Apenninic people would slowly retreat to the interior of Italy, leaving the coast to the Villanovans. But with that being said, the two cultures did mix. This mixing can be seen when the Proto-Villanovans began painting designs on their urns with a white paint, which had been ingrained in the Apenninic people's society for hundreds of years. The Proto-Villanovans would slowly develop into fully fledged Villanovans in Italy, independent from other urnfield cultures. This leads us into the first period of true Villanovans, which starts in the 9th century BC and is aptly called Villanovan I. The Villanovans lived almost 3,000 years ago, meaning nearly everything of theirs is lost except for their graves. What we do know is that when the Villanovans founded a settlement, it was meant to be permanent. So permanent, in fact, that many of these cities still survive to this day, albeit not as grand. These settlements would be made up of tons of round or rectangular wattle and daub huts. Their burial sites would be within, but on the edge of town, and would be filled with buried urns that had along with them various grave goods. There are two types of urns the Villanovans used. The first were biconical, with a lid and a single handle. If there was ever two handles, then one of them would be deliberately broken off to conform to the tradition. The second type was a hut-shaped urn, which was more common in the south of Etruria. In fact, some were even found in Rome itself. These huts were replicas of the houses of the living, possibly to give dead a place to live after death. Both would be buried with grave goods, which reflected the dead person's interest. For example, we have found miniature boats as grave goods, which points to the existence of a merchant class. This is backed up with the discovery of Sardinian goods within Villanovan sites. Sardinia, even to this day, is a hotbed for many natural resources, such as iron, copper, tin, and silver, which were all crucial to Villanovan society. An early example of social stratification is with the warrior class. The warriors were also cremated, buried, and put into an urn, but their lids were helmets to denote their warrior class. These helmets were often made out of metal rather than the usual pottery. As the Villanovan I period came to an end, we started to see more social stratification, with graves becoming more elaborate and grave goods representing social prestige starting to appear. This is brought on by the increase in foreign contact the Villanovans made with other cultures in the Mediterranean. The Villanovan II period starts in the early 8th century BC, which is when the Greeks began the colonization of Pithecusae and Cumae in Italy. These forward outposts by the Greeks made both trade and diffusion of culture much easier with the Villanovans. During this time, the Villanovans picked up a lot from the Greeks, which can be seen in the art of the time. The Villanovans began producing geometric art with long, wiry figures of men, women, and horses. Grave goods even became more elaborate, with the appearance of horse bits and chariot parts being seen in the richest of graves. This shows us the importance of the horse in not only Villanovan aristocracy, but also later Etrurian, Roman, and general Italian aristocracy. It was the Greeks who may have introduced the Villanovans to wine and started their own shops in Villanovan cities, practicing their trade and taking Villanovans as apprentices and teaching them the Greek ways of art and culture. Towards the end of the Villanovan II period, the Villanovans even began trading with people from the Near East, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. This trade with the East would send the Villanovans into the Orientalizing period in 720 BC, where the Villanovans started to become truly Etruscan. Now, what is the Orientalizing period? The Orientalizing period is fascinating, which sees either the Villanovans become Etruscans or invaded by the Etruscans. The question of where the Etruscans come from is a hotly debated question, which is beyond the scope of just this video. What is known for certain, however, is that the Orientalizing period would change Italy just as much, if not more, than the Villanovan period that preceded it. But that will be covered later in a full video dedicated to the Orientalizing period. While the Villanovans are a relatively unknown people, what we do know of them points to them being an advanced culture of the time that began Italy's shift from semi-nomadism into the great permanent cities of Etruria and Rome. And while these people transformed the land they settled in, they also allowed themselves to be transformed and influenced by the people that they came into contact with. It is the great Italian tradition of cultural flexibility which gave Rome all the tools it needed to conquer much of the known world. Without Etruria, we would not have Rome itself.